To help somebody change their perspective, the most reliable approach is to tell them a story. Why tell stories? If we're trying to communicate a new creative product, whether that's an insight we've generated to change our perspectives, or an invention to address a need, or an enlightenment that represents new knowledge about the world, the best starting point that we know of is to tell a story. What is it about stories that make them effective? Well, stories force us to start at the beginning. When we ourselves have thought through something, gone through a creative process, then we are at the end. This means that when we start communicating, we have a tendency to start at the end. But when we force ourselves to tell stories, we have to start at the beginning. And this is critical because often the endings of stories only make sense because we've lived through the beginning and the middle. When we tell stories, we're inclined to start at the beginning, go through the middle, and get to the ending. This way, people are with us. Just think about a simple story. How about a children's story? Take The Three Little Pigs, for example. The highlight of the story, a wolf blows and does not knock down a pig's house. I mean, that is weird. It is a crazy story. It doesn't make any sense unless you already know the story, in which case it does make sense. We have to tell people the story. We do not have to tell people the exact story that we lived through to generate the creative product. That's a separate issue. Our actual story may or may not be helpful for them to hear, but it's very helpful to tell some kind of a story. That way, it will be accessible to our audience. And not just accessible. If we start at the beginning, proceed in a sensible manner, and arrive at an ending, then people are not only likely to understand what we've said, but they're also likely to be able to remember what we say. Then they can act on the story when a situation arises. For example, I can tell you a story about a problem at work. The other day I went to a meeting. I knew a lot of people there, but there was this one guy, and I could not recall whether I'd ever met him before. That could be a bit awkward, right? I'm not sure what to say. But for some reason, maybe it's just luck, I happened to say, "It's nice to be with you." And he smiled, and I smiled, and we were on to the meeting. And later I realized that was actually a pretty useful phrase because it allows the other person to interpret it positively, regardless of whether we've indeed met before and I'm forgetful, or we're just meeting for the first time. Now that I've told you that story, if you are ever in that situation, maybe you'll remember this story and then you have something to say that could help you. Stories are little suggestions for guiding how we think and how we behave. And it's not just us. We can tell stories that we have heard to somebody new. If I have a new idea and I tell a story to somebody about it, I'm helping that person understand it and see the idea's value. And then I'm giving them something easy to remember, and I'm giving them something they can turn around and tell to somebody new. So if you start by forming a story, you might not have to say anything else. So we want to tell a story, but we have to tell the right story, or at least a right story.
Right, depending on who you're talking to, right?
Yeah, so how do we think through our audience? So let's chat a little bit about that.
Sure.
What's going to enable us to take the perspective of the group to whom we are pitching our story?
Yeah, and there's a lot of research to back up the power of perspective taking. We're really trying to see the world through your eyes and try and walk in your shoes and really imagine the world as you see it. Really helps me, envision your concerns, and I think that's the real key to to tailoring to your audience.
Right. Well, a story that may really be meaningful to me may not be to you,
right.
And a story that may be meaningful to you is the one that's important for me to tell you.
Right.
So
how do you think through those?
How do we think through those? So I think we want to think about a couple different kinds of people and take their perspective. So the first is, who's the audience that's going to be needing this change in perspective, right? So who's the person who needs to hear my story?
Yeah.
And what is why does it matter to them? What's important to them?
Right.
And so that's one perspective we want to think about. And then the other one, and these could be overlapping, is who might not want to hear this story?
Right.
Who might not want to hear this idea? Who's going to be unhappy?
Resistant, to change.
Exactly.
Sure.
Who's our resistant to change group? And then why are they resistant to change? What is being threatened? Is it just their habits, or does this go against their values? What is it that's driving that resistance?
Right.
And then the idea is to try and think about, with both of these folks, the folks who really need to hear the message, the people who may resist the message, well, what message would actually resonate with them? What kinds of concerns do they have? What's their self-concept? What's their identity?
Right.
And what are their cares and values?
Right, so the creativity will end up not just being novel, but also helpful to the people, the recipients of it. And so that's a really key element.
Yeah, we need to make it appropriate to the audience.
Right.
And then once we have a sense of that audience, we need to start generating that focus story for that particular group. And so now we have to think about our message, right? And there's a series of questions we can think about to help us craft that particular message. So clearly we want to think about, well, what's the specific new idea or change that we're pitching, right?
Yeah.
What is it that we want to convey? And it's easy to have that abstractly and fuzzy. It's hard to really get that clean and precise. What's the core issue? How simple can I possibly make it?
Right.
So that's the first one. And then the second one is, do we have a test case? Is there a case where this idea worked? Is there a way to be concrete about why this change matters or where it's already been implemented successfully, so that we can have a success case on which to build?
Right.
So that's something that could be useful.
And what I'm hearing as well is that this takes a lot of preparation. You don't just go to an audience and tell a story without all of this deep level thought around, who you're encountering and what their motives are and concerns are, so you can tailor it.
Yeah, I mean, most of what we say to one another, we forget.
Right.
I mean, frankly, and some stories have been told for thousands of years.
Yeah.
Right. So, do you want your communications to matter and have impact, and for people to turn around and retell your story to other people?
Right.
So, if that matters, then we have to prepare. So, and then can you think about also perspective taking? Can the main character in your story be like your audience, so that they can easily envision themselves as the protagonist in your story, right? Make it easy for them to take the perspective in the story, right?
And that draws them in, and then they're going to recall your message.
Exactly, because they can envision themselves there. Can we emphasize not only the opportunity, that shining, the world will be great if we take my idea or something like that? Can we also envision the opposite, right?
Yeah.
Should we envision, are things going to be problematic if my idea isn't heard, right? What's the threat? What's the opportunity that we'll miss if we don't share that? And then will the outcome of this idea, does it take us in a direction that we're all going to find exciting, right? Why is the audience going to want this idea to succeed, right? What exciting outcome do they want and care about that this idea is going to enable them to get to? So, do we have a clear purpose? Have we removed all the unnecessary detail so that this one key core idea gets across? And that's what we want to do as our homework for telling these stories. So we take the perspective of the audience, and then we think really, really clearly on what they want and care about, what their concerns are, and how we can emphasize the value of this idea to them. We have to tell a story, but how do we tell a great story? A story that will interest people and make them want to pay attention, and that will stick with them and that they'll remember later on and want to tell somebody else. Well, one starting point is the wonderful work by Chip Heath and Dan Heath in their book Made to Stick. In addition to talking about the power of stories, they also talk about how to help make stories great. The first point is to keep your message simple. Keep the story simple so that your point doesn't get lost and people don't get confused. For example, the other day, my daughter said to my wife and to me that she had a test in one class this morning and then a swimming practice after school from 5 to 7, but that she was studying with a friend at the library, and between school and swimming and later she'd have to meet with a group on a project, but they wouldn't meet in person and instead do everything online. And I said, whoa, you need a ride home at 7? Keep it simple. Just tell me I need a ride home at 7. Now, Stephen Denning tells a fantastic and very simple story in his book, The Springboard. It's a story that changed the World Bank. And the story, it's 2 sentences long. In addition to simplicity, we also want to use surprise. A story that is only 2 sentences long and changed the World Bank? How can a story change a bank? And how can a story that short change a bank? That's surprising. We've already noticed that surprises can lead people to change their perspectives. Stories teach us that one reason why is that surprises can generate curiosity. We didn't expect that to work, or we didn't expect that to happen, and now I want to listen to find out what happened. Stories with surprises can make our audiences pay attention and can make them want to hear our ideas. Surprises also generate emotions. The stories that generate emotions in other ways are also important. It's not just surprise, because emotions make us more likely to pay attention, to remember, and to want to share our stories with other people. For example, Chip Heath with Marwan Sineker and Steve Cole, I think, did a study examining beef consumption in France. Surprise! Who thought we'd be talking about that? Well, what they did was they examined how often newspapers reported on mad cow disease. They also tracked how often scientific terms for the same disease were mentioned, things like bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or whatever you call it. Well, if you count the number of times the newspapers say mad cow disease, what you find is that the more times they say it, the less people tend to buy beef. But the scientific term, it doesn't really matter how often the media said it, the more emotional term matters more. When they say mad cow disease, nobody buys beef anymore. When they say something like bovine spongiform encephalopathy, doesn't matter. It doesn't make a difference to beef consumption. So for many people, like me, mad cow disease is concrete, it's simple, and that concreteness helps our stories because it makes them accessible to wide audiences. Almost anyone can hear a simple, concrete story and understand it. If you want a wide array of people to understand your ideas, you have to make it easy by making it concrete and simple. Finally, you have to be credible. People have to believe your stories. Maybe you have data and that's how you're being credible. Or maybe you're an expert and your audience recognizes that and so has a tendency to want to believe you. Or maybe you tell someone about something that happened that sounds plausible and they just never noticed or thought about it that way. There are a variety of ways in which we can be credible and tell credible stories. Okay, so we've waited long enough. I mentioned Stephen Denning's 2-sentence story about the World Bank, but I never told it to you. You need a little background. It was 1997. The internet, it was still really new. Most of the work was done with a lot of travel and a lot of lag time. For example, at the World Bank, they sent people all over the world to try to help them improve their societies. They would be out in some rural destination trying to figure out how to help a community build a road or handle malaria, something like that. The World Bank employees would travel, find out what was going on, go back to the home office, gather the information they needed from experts in the organization to solve the problem, and then go back out to the region with answers. It could take months. So it's in 1997, and here is Stephen Denning's story. A couple years ago, in 1995, a health worker in Kamana, an out-of-the-way town in Zambia, logs onto the Center for Disease Control's website, finds an answer on how to treat malaria. The next day they go to work and apply the answer. There you go. It's a pretty simple, concrete, credible story. But what's surprising about that story? Why was that story shocking to the World Bank in 1997? It was shocking for two reasons. One, rather than it taking months to solve a problem, one of their employees got all the information they needed to solve a problem in a few minutes, online. No travel, no waiting for the mail. And two, the World Bank isn't even part of the story. Their employee got what they needed from another organization's website. The World Bank realized they needed a complete change in how they did their work. Stories are powerful, particularly if they are simple, surprising, emotional, concrete, and credible, as Chip and Dan Heath advise us in their great book, Made to Stick. Now, I have to admit I'm a little biased. I'm a fan of Chip and Dan Heath's book, Made to Stick, not only because it's a great book, but also because I've had the pleasure of working with Chip. Now, our project examined one recipe for surprise. That was an idea that struck us as a little bit strange at first, a recipe for surprise. But after a dozen studies, we have some pretty good reasons to believe it now. It all started when I was doing some research with young children together with Deidre Gettner, the cognitive scientist most known for her work on analogy. And Deidre called one of our studies the Billy Goat Gruff study. Now, the Billy Goat Gruff story is a lot like the Three Little Pigs story that I mentioned earlier. A wolf was chasing three pigs, the pigs ran away, wanted to protect themselves. One made a house of straw, but the wolf blew it down. Another made a house of sticks, the wolf blew it down. The third made a house of bricks, and although the wolf blew, the house remained firm. The pigs lived happily ever after. Well, the Billy Goat Gruff story is basically the same thing. Pretty similar. Three goats are in a pasture. One goat leaves to go over a bridge, talks to a troll into letting him pass because a bigger, tastier goat is coming. The second goat goes over the bridge, talks the troll into letting him pass because a bigger, tastier goat is coming. And the third goat's big enough, he knocks the troll off the bridge. Now, in both of these folk tales for young children, The Three Little Billy Goats Gruff and The Three Little Pigs, the first two events are nearly identical. And because they're identical, we compare them and form an expectation about what is going to come next. When the next event comes and violates the pattern set by the earlier events, we're surprised. Well, we might have heard these stories before, but this plot structure of repeated similar events followed by a break event generally tends to generate surprising stories. We call them repetition break stories. You've probably heard jokes that start, I don't know, a priest, a minister, and a rabbi are standing at the gates of heaven, or three politicians were sitting in a duck blind, or three guys walk into a bar. All these are using the repetition break plot structure. Or maybe you've heard MasterCard's Priceless campaign. I think my favorite was an 18-speed bike, $1,200. Shipping the bike to Italy, $300. Map of Tuscany, $20. 7 days without email, priceless. It's the same structure. There's an event, cost, an event, a cost, an event, a cost, event, priceless. Or there's the old Gershwin song, They Can't Take That Away From Me. The way your smile just beams, the way you sing off key, the way you haunt my dreams. They can't take that away from me. There are countless numbers of songs, jokes, folktales, advertisements, and other stories that use the repetition break plot structure. And compared to similar stories, people tend to be more interested, more surprised, more engaged by repetition break stories. They tend to make more persuasive advertisements. They tend to increase people's attitudes about the brand, increase their purchase intentions for that item relative to ads with other plot structures. They're more likely to win awards, ads with a repetition break plot structure. They're more likely to have more views on YouTube and more hits on Google. So stories matter, surprising stories matter, and the repetition break story is one way to generate surprise. So what we've been talking about is how to tell a good story, in a way.
It turns out that's useful.
It turns out that's really useful.
Right.
So starting with something really concrete that anyone can understand and arrive at, and then go on the journey to arrive at a new perspective.
Right.
So make it easy for people to do and experience. And the thing I think we've learned is that telling a good story is hard, but there are things we can do to make our stories better, and we just have to edit and refine and improve upon them.
Right, and it leads to a deeper understanding of the idea itself,
Yeah.
as opposed to the kind of social influence pitch approach in which you don't really care necessarily if someone understands your perspective. You just want to push it through.
And it gets to this other interesting side, which is if I actually do the work to change my perspective and hear your story and am convinced by it, I might go tell somebody else, right? And I can, and then they can get convinced, and they can tell the story to another person.
Right.
And so there's this compounding effect of you're not just pitching, you're giving them a way to pitch the
And
next
ideas
person.
spread.
And ideas spread. So when we're thinking about pitching, then we've got a lot to think about. We have, you know, how can I get you in this moment to feel yes?
Yeah.
And how can I get you to change your perspective? And knowing that, how can I go ahead and plan a whole story to get you to the point where you've now changed your beliefs and you can go share that with the world?
And what we've done is given you really tools that you can use to formulate your strategy for pitching ideas effectively. So knowing your audience, what their limits are and what their interests are, and then knowing how to formulate your approach that is best suited for whoever you're talking to.
Right. What's the context? Who are they? What do they care about?
Right.
Why would this strike them as interesting and important?
Yeah.
And then how can I get them to that point so that they can jump up and down?
And endorse your idea
And
and share it with others even.
Yeah. Excellent.